Hey everybody, and we're here at Playing It Forward Violin, and today we have a very special guest with us. We have Nancy Zhou, who's an American classical violinist who's won multiple awards with competitions all over the world, especially the 2018 Shanghai Isaac Stern International Violin Competition and the 2018 International Music Competition Harbin. So, Nancy, welcome to Playing It Forward. You're the first guest for the show. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very honored. It's a big pleasure to be on here.
Perfect. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm currently in New York City, which is where I'm currently based. It's a bit turbulent now because, there are several states in the U.S. which are entering the second phase in the pandemic. So it's a bit crazy now with what's going on geographically and also.
And how are you holding up with everything that's going on worldwide and with you right there? How are you holding up with everything?
Well, it was quite strange because when we first entered the pandemic and lockdown, it was a bit, I felt very disappointed because I couldn't go on stage and perform anymore. So it's just such an abrupt transition. But now I started getting used to it and finding my own rhythm and teaching online and doing live stream concerts. So it's quite nice. It's just a much more, I guess, it's a very different alternative, but still very meaningful in some ways.
I think everyone's getting used to that fact that, live performances, attending concerts are slowly easing up right now, and hopefully we should see that within the next few months. You've been performing multiple times, and I've always wondered, how do you prepare mentally for that kind of pressure? Because you've obviously won first prize on a couple of these competitions, and how do you prepare that mental pressure? I think that's key important, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it takes many failures, unless you are someone who is a superhuman and just have not really had much experience with falling down. But for me, the last two successes, so to speak, was in 2018, and that was my greatest year. But before that, I entered many competitions, had many less than successful concerts. So it's I guess it's a long process of knowing how to counter moments of failure and knowing how to raise yourself up again. But mentally, I think it's over the years, it takes almost a lifetime because presenting yourself in front of masses of people isn't exactly the easiest thing to do. So it takes many performance opportunities, no matter how small or how big, in order to kind of situate yourself comfortably into that mental situation. So, yeah.
Well, and what do you tell yourself in your head before you go out to the stage?
Well, I've done many experiments. I've told myself not to be nervous, but of course that doesn't really work. Sometimes it's more about, I think, meditating and not telling yourself anything, and rather just cleaning your mind and trying not to think too much about how others perceive you, because that's, I think, the one issue that many people probably struggle with before they go on stage. Especially when you do competitions, that's even more of an explicit thing that, because there is a panel of jury members who are there grading you and grading you based on a point system, which is total nonsense if you consider, what we do as professional musicians. It's all about music. But essentially, it's just, I think I find sometime, I usually like to go to the concert venue about an hour before to spend about half an hour meditating and cleaning my mind, trying to not think about anything, just let my mind wander. And then I spend the next half hour warming up and eating some blueberries.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And having said that, what is like some of the sort of like funny experiences that you've had or interesting over the years that you've been performing on stage? What's the funniest thing that's happened to you on the stage?
Oh, I don't know if it's quite funny. It's quite scary, I have to say. This was back in 2011 when I did the Tchaikovsky competition. And back then I was 17 years old. And that was, I think, my second international competition. So I was still quite a fresh face in the circuit. But I remember when I was playing the second round, we were in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. So it's a beautiful hall and very resonant. And I was playing a commissioned work and my E string slipped off the bridge. So that was very daunting for me. And this was a piece that required our strings to be tuned out of the normal setup that we have, E, A, D, G, right? So we had to tune, I think, the E string slightly flatter. And because of that, and because I think I did something quite fiercely with my bow, it just completely knocked the E string off. And so I had to stop midway the performance and then start over again after.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
so it was great. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a funny experience, but I think that was the one moment that really stuck out and became really ingrained in my memory.
Now you perform with various orchestras all over the world. How do you cope with sort of like, is there any language barriers in terms of communicating with the orchestra, or is that pretty much automatic? How does it work?
It's pretty much an easy process. I've not had many experiences working with orchestras that don't speak English, because most orchestras are comprised of quite a diverse group of people. Even if it's not, for example, I did play in Poland. They spoke, many members also spoke proficient English. And even if it's not the case with members of the orchestra, conductors are always, able to communicate in English and translate.
Perfect. And what is like the one unforgettable performance that you still have in memory right now?
Yeah, that would certainly be the final performance at the Isaac Stern competition. So 2 years ago. Yeah, that was, I think, one of maybe the only time where I felt entirely confident on stage and just felt that I owned the piece, that I owned the way that I was presenting it, and that I just had maximum confidence.
Perfect.
Right. Going to move on to some questions regarding equipment and techniques. So besides the instrument, what else do you keep inside your violin case?
Yeah, I have it here, but it's not within my reach now. But I have a card from an orchestra that I particularly bonded very well together. So it's just a greeting card. And in my pouch, I have all the kind of musician's necessities, like rosin. I do have a set of strings, I believe. I'm not really on top of that. Just in case something happens during concerts, you always need a backup set of strings. And Kleenex. Always need Kleenex, tissues. Pencil, and a little, I don't consider a lucky charm, but it's from a really good friend from my childhood. She gifted me this, because I love horses, this horse eraser that I never managed to use. So that's in there. And then I have also a chin rest cover that you put on the chin rest to prevent, because my skin is quite sensitive.
Okay.
So that I always put like a protective pad so that sweat doesn't, infect the area. And what else do I have? I have 2 handkerchiefs that I like to use as well during concerts, because depending on the climate and depending on the temperature of the venue, I sometimes sweat profusely. And then because I don't use a shoulder rest when I play, it could also result in the violin slipping if I start sweating too much. So I like to use a handkerchief. And then I have another bow. I have 2 bows in total that I put in my case. Yeah.
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
I think that is it. Oh, a nail clipper.
Oh, nail clip. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. Yeah. And I have a kind of technique questions for you. So as you know, for adult beginners, we are really always struggling with approach to a new piece. So like, how do you deal with frustrations when you learn a piece or a particularly difficult movement?
Well, yeah, I think that's quite a full question, but I would like to say, to start off, generally speaking, that it's always important to know exactly what makes the piece difficult. So pinpointing, if there's a certain challenging section, ask yourself, why is it difficult? What kind of techniques are involved in that passage? So, for example, in the notorious passage from the ending of the first movement of Sibelius, you have the fingered octaves. So for a while, for me personally, that was a huge challenge. And so I asked myself, well, okay, let's just focus on that. It's fingered octaves that make it very difficult. And then I would go back and then try to look up exercises or do some research on what kind of exercises will help with fingered octaves. And then what is difficult about fingered octaves? So for example, stretching of the fingers and making your fingers a little bit more flexible, because that is essentially what violin playing is about when you come to look at the left hand. So with the left hand, it's about building strength and flexibility. So you would have to work on exercises that help you train for that, right? And the other thing that I think is extremely important is to mentally prepare yourself to take the time to work on that. So patience, and approaching it correctly. So these are the two elements that are very important.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you practice every day?
I do. I try to.
Also, like, how many hours do you take for your practice sessions?
I think it varies. Sometimes I of course have off days where I just certainly don't want to practice. And on those days, I would just say maybe at least an hour or two. Of course, it's not going to be as productive as the days where I practice, on average 5 to 6 hours. But the idea is to always to set yourself, to find the balance between keeping it regulated, keeping your practice regulated and consistent, but to also allow yourself the time to just say, well, it's okay to not want to practice, but just squeeze in amount of time. So that's why I think planning your practice sessions, knowing what you want to work on each day is very important, because then at least you have an orientation. And if you don't have some level of organization, then it could be much easier for you to say, well, I just won't practice today, whatever, So it's good to have some form of goals and time related structure to the whole idea of practicing. So, I mean, with that said, I do keep a practice journal. Sometimes I don't stick to it, which is totally fine. That happens because we are human. But I think in general, it's just nice to keep yourself informed of your progress. And yeah, so the most I do is about 6 hours each day.
Right. Oh, wow, that's a lot.
Oh, wow.
So how many hours do you usually practice before a competition then?
Oh, that's exception. So for the Isaac Stern, I actually started preparing for the competition about half a year before the actual first round. And then back then I attended a school called the Queen Elizabeth Music Chapelle, and that's located in Waterloo, Belgium. And this school is basically located in the middle of nowhere. So you have nothing to distract you. There's no city life. It's a small town, and it's located in the middle of the woods. So there's really just, it's pure isolation. So that's where I spent my time preparing for the competition. And each day, I think I practiced around 8 to 10 hours.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's really a lot of practice time, And we all practice etudes, right? So in your opinion, how important are etudes, and how has that developed your technique?
Well, when I was younger, I studied with my father before I went to college. So my father was a huge advocate for scales and Paganini caprices. Now, I don't think Paganini caprices are they are kind of etudes, but it's just a very advanced form. So when I was a child, I never really had any experience with etudes. So I mainly practiced scales and exercises, and even with exercises, it was very limited time. So it was, the majority of the time was spent on scales and double stops, but all in scalar progressions. It was only until I went to college, I think it was my third year, when I found out about this Greek pedagogue named Konstantin Junis. So he had experience in the I think it was in the First World War, and he was a neuroscientist, so a neurosurgeon, and he really just opened my eyes on how important exercises are, in terms of knowing exactly how to navigate your fingers and knowing what muscles are involved in certain techniques, and knowing how to work on maintaining the conditions of your nerves and what to do to counterbalance situations where you become very jittery because you're super nervous. So that was very eye-opening, in the sense that I discovered that there's something very scientific about instrumental playing that people maybe oftentimes don't think too much about. And that was when I became super obsessive with exercises for the violin. So in that sense, I don't think etudes are as important as exercises, because etudes is kind of like a middle ground. It's kind of like the middleman between, or the middle step between exercises and pieces. Because with etudes, it's a good opportunity for you to of course, condition certain techniques that you have built through practicing exercises, and also thinking about, for example, phrasing or musicality. So it's a nice compromise between pieces and exercises. For me, I've dabbled a little bit on, for example, Dante etudes and Dante and what else? Kreutzer. I've done a little bit when I was young as well, but I think that etudes is kind of something that you don't need, or you do need. It just depends on the person himself. Yeah, but I think exercises is definitely a prerequisite for everyone. So everyone needs to go through that at one point or another. Yeah.
And I mean, you're talking about exercises. Could you just probably give us an example? Like, what's the typical exercise then?
So for me, I think this is also a question that deserves a much longer answer, but because there's so much involved with violin playing, but I would say the most important thing is to develop a certain degree of flexibility and strength in your fingers. So coordinating finger independence, for example. So there are many exercises. The fundamental one that I always do to warm up every day, even now, is just something that's involved with not the right hand, it's just with the left hand, where you isolate 3 of the 4 fingers that you use, and then you exercise one finger without moving the rest. So that's called exercises that train for finger independence.
Wow. Okay.
And that becomes very important when you have, for example, fast passages with continuous 16th notes, and there are runs that you need to play very cleanly, and you don't want the rest of the fingers to trip over, a finger or two.
That's a very good point. I mean, from the way we've basically watched on YouTube, your playing is really, really clean. It's something that we as adult beginners, we aspire to at least play a little bit cleaner each time until we go Nancy Zhou clean level. That kind of like the higher tier grade. So I mean, there's something for adult beginners that I think maybe you could share. What are the top 3 techniques that we can focus on at our current level? Let's say from the grade 1 to grade 5, that sort of like that threshold. Yeah. What can we do to sort of like concentrate on improving better?
Okay, so I would say the first thing is, for, I think, adult beginners, what maybe many people struggle with is, because at that time, I guess the body has a certain degree of rigidity, so being too rigid for something. And I think the idea is to loosen up those muscles here. And with that, that means that it's a bit like doing yoga, and I like to call it yoga for fingers, where it involves, stretching. I can kind of show you if you'd like, but basically the idea is to stretch fingers out so that you have a degree of suppleness in the muscles in between each digit. So doing things like that, I mean, it's not going to be too specific, and then again, the same concept, always keeping 3 fingers intact without moving them, and then stretching them out,
Oh, that's great. Yep.
And then, for each finger, there's always something that you can do. And of course, there are degrees of difficulty for doing the actual stretching. So you can start out quite minimal, and then really just focus on doing the resistance training for that. The next thing that I would say is working on vibrato. So vibrato is something that's quite ominous, almost, like the concept, because it's so big and people get kind of confused exactly how to navigate the vibrato. But essentially what I think is that no matter if you're looking at recordings on YouTube of great artists, they all have very different vibrato. But the one thing that they have in common is that their fingers are always quite flexible. So like the finger joints are very flexible when they do the vibrato motion. So in that sense, I always like to think the vibrato always initiates from the fingers rather than, because people talk about like arm vibrato, wrist vibrato, and then finger vibrato.
That's correct.
But I think in some way or another, all 3 types, it's not a question of arm, wrist, and hand. It's rather a question of how active each part is. But the initial impulse always comes from the fingers, and that's why it's very important to develop a certain a suppleness. So I also like to work on vibrato exercises using very different rhythm patterns, and then focusing on just making everything really nice and elastic, because elasticity and strength, I think those are, once you find the correct balance between these 2 elements, then violin playing isn't really as hard as you thought it would be. But I mean, of course, for adult beginners, I think the most difficult part is to really soften up the tension, inner tension in your muscles, because I mean, you just start, if you're just beginning the instrument, it might just become too difficult to do that, because it's of course very hard when you think about violin playing at first if you're new, but the idea is to really take the time out, carve the time, and you really need patience. Patience is more important to people who are in their in their 40s or 50s than for example, a young teenager or a young child, because children oftentimes have much softer muscles, so it's much more easy to train and develop.
Okay, I mean, that's some really interesting where you emphasize on sort of like the scientific approach through the understanding of medical sort of like the limitations that you may have. And in order to get rid of these limitations, you do certain exercises that may help you loosen up. And I think that's also important because I've personally played, got off bit, start bowing, and it just doesn't sound like anything. But there are some days where I would literally stretch while listening to a performance, and I play better. So I think that's something I can totally echo with you in terms of, for us, especially adults, to loosen up, relax, have patience, take your time, and do the exercise that you've mentioned earlier. So I think this, the whole point of this Playing It Forward Violin is to give this type of information to us as adult beginners, so we can sort of like have a bit of a shortcut to go and improve quicker. And that's what everybody wants. But at the same time, understand there are also limitations that we as adults face and work around it. So having said all of this really amazing information you shared, what's next for Nancy Zhou? What's next for you?
You mean in the next 5 years or in the next year?
What are your plans coming up? I mean, we're starting to see COVID sort of like easing up, and countries are starting to speak to each other about travels and blah blah blah. And I don't
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
what are your
Yeah.
thoughts about?
Well, I actually received some disappointing news about Europe banning travel, Americans entering the European Union. So that actually stressed me out for a while, because I was supposed to have some concerts in Italy next year.
Okay.
And I really don't know if that's going to happen, depending on, how the US copes with the situation. But all fingers crossed that, there's a positive direction in how the administration is dealing with the whole thing. But yeah, concerts are being planned. Luckily, most of my concerts that got canceled for this year are postponed rather than just completely canceled. So I am looking forward to a year of 2021 being, quite nicely busy with performances, and
Okay.
being able to travel again would be such a privilege. Yeah.
I think that's a privilege. I would concur that again,
Yeah.
because I think this is something where Song and we've been talking. She's based in UK. I'm here in Singapore, and
Yeah.
we hope to visit each other, and then we'll probably do a masterclass. Some, not us. We don't give masterclass. We organize masterclasses. Don't get us wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something we hopefully in the near future, Nancy, we could actually have you to do a masterclass for us.
It'd be a pleasure.
It will be amazing for a closed door event, and that's something where we're probably looking for that. So Nancy, thank you so much for your time today, and really appreciate you sharing this information with us. And I really wish you all the best. And we
Thank you.
hopefully
Thank
me
you.
and Song will love to go to your performance.
Thank you. I'll keep you posted.
I want a free ticket.
Of course, there are always comp tickets.
Okay, thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you for everyone for watching Playing It Forward Violin Episode 1 with Nancy Zhou. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
informative.
Thank you. Bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.